In the quiet, affluent streets of Mosman, Sydney, it was easy to believe that nothing evil could ever take root. The trees were tall, the streets were clean, and the air smelled of salt from the nearby harbor. To the families that lived here, life was serene, predictable, safe. But something dark was festering beneath that illusion, and it all started with a man who wore the perfect disguise, a warm smile. John Wayne Glover was a man you wouldn't look twice at. In fact, you'd likely smile back if you passed him in the grocery store, standing at an average height, with thinning hair and a pleasant demeanor. He looked like the kind of neighbor who might help you take out the trash, or stop by with a gift basket at Christmas. He was the quintessential nice guy, or at least, that's what he wanted everyone to believe. Glover was born in England, but had immigrated to Australia in his 20s. Over the years, he built a simple, quiet life. He had a wife, 2 stepdaughters, and worked as a salesman for a pie company. To most, he was just another middle-aged man trying to make ends meet. But there was something beneath his calm exterior, something angry, something cruel. Friends and neighbors remembered John as polite, helpful, and well-mannered. He volunteered at the local senior citizen society, driving elderly women to their doctor's appointments or simply chatting over tea. He was particularly charming with older women, often calling them love or darling. They trusted him. They welcomed his kindness. What no one knew was that Glover was nursing a deep, festering hatred. Psychologists would later speculate that it stemmed from unresolved trauma, a loathing for older women who reminded him of authority figures from his past, an abusive mother, controlling women, relationships that left him feeling powerless. He was, at his core, a man desperate for control, and when life didn't offer him the dominance he craved, he sought it elsewhere. The first known murder occurred in March of 1989. Glover had been wandering through a shopping center when he noticed an elderly woman walking slowly with a cane. He followed her from a distance, his expression unreadable. Minutes later, she was dead. Her body was discovered, slumped beside a walking path, her head battered, and her pantyhose tied tightly around her neck. It seemed random at first, a brutal mugging, perhaps. But something about the scene was off. Her handbag was still there. Her body was positioned carefully, and the killer had taken the time to wipe down the scene. Police chalked it up to street violence, but Glover had just committed his first murder, and he had gotten away with it. After that, it was as if a switch had been flipped. The man who had been holding back for years, maybe decades, was now free to act on his urges, and Mosman would pay the price. As weeks passed, Glover resumed his normal life. He made deliveries. He kissed his wife goodnight. He mowed the lawn. But something had changed in him. He had tasted blood, and the hunger was growing in his mind. He believed he was righting a wrong, punishing women who represented the pain he had endured. In reality, he was murdering innocent grandmothers who posed no threat, no harm, and no defense. By the time police connected the dots, it was too late. The smiling stranger had already claimed another victim, and then another, and another. What was most disturbing wasn't just the way Glover killed. It was the ease with which he blended back into society afterward. He could kill a woman in the park at noon, and by evening, he'd be at a neighborhood barbecue, cracking jokes and sipping beer. The mask he wore wasn't forced. It was natural, seamless. That's what made him so terrifying. One neighbor would later say, "He was the last person you'd ever expect. I used to wave to him every morning. I even had him over for dinner. I never saw anything in his eyes. Nothing, just blankness." As the body count rose, so did the paranoia. Elderly women who once strolled through the neighborhood now stayed indoors. Families moved their mothers and grandmothers out of the area. But the killer remained invisible, a ghost hiding in plain sight, and all the while, Glover was slipping deeper into darkness. Each murder made him bolder, more confident, more convinced that he would never be caught. Because after all, who would suspect the man with the kind eyes and the gentle voice? The answer was no one. And that's exactly how John Wayne Glover, the so-called monster of Mosman, wanted it. The murders were not random. That much became clear as the body count rose. Each victim, another elderly woman, each killing disturbingly similar in execution. It was as if the killer had a personal vendetta, yet no clear motive surfaced. The scenes were too clean, too deliberate. Detectives who arrived at the various crime scenes felt something was off. It wasn't just the brutality of the murders, it was the quiet order behind them. Each body was discovered in a public space, driveways, walkways. They weren't hidden or discarded. They were displayed, almost respectfully, and always the same details. Elderly women in their 70s or 80s, their heads bludgeoned with a blunt object, their own stockings wrapped tightly around their necks in a grotesque, unmistakable double knot. The killer didn't just want to end their lives. He wanted to leave a message, one that was becoming increasingly loud and clear to investigators. The weapon of choice, though often assumed to be improvised, was surprisingly consistent. A small hammer, lightweight, easy to conceal, and capable of delivering fatal force without attracting too much attention. It allowed him to move through crowds undetected, to approach his victims without raising suspicion. To them, he must have seemed like any other passerby, a harmless man offering a smile or a helping hand. And then, in an instant, the mask slipped, the hammer struck, the stockings tightened. Detective Sergeant Dennis Bray was among the first to voice concern about the pattern. He noted the frequency, the victim profile, and the meticulousness of each scene. "This isn't just violence," he would later say. "This is someone working through something, someone with a plan." But what that plan was, and who was behind it, remained a mystery. The public demanded answers, and the pressure mounted. As fear swept across Sydney's northern suburbs, women who had once walked their dogs or ran errands alone now stayed indoors. Community centers closed early. Panic was beginning to spread, especially among the elderly. They were no longer safe in broad daylight. That was the most chilling part. This killer was bold. He didn't wait for the cover of night. He attacked in the open, struck hard, fast, and vanished without a trace. Witnesses were few, and those who had seen something described nothing more than a man of average build, wearing nondescript clothes. There were no fingerprints, no hair, no clear suspect. The media dubbed him the Granny Killer, a name that both sensationalized and trivialized the true horror of what was happening. Behind every headline was a grieving family, a community in mourning, and a killer who seemed to be enjoying his work. The name may have grabbed attention, but for detectives, it only intensified the urgency. They knew they were dealing with someone methodical, someone intelligent. This wasn't the work of a drug addict or a desperate thief. This was someone who blended into the world around him, someone who watched and waited. It was around this time that investigators began reviewing CCTV footage from shopping centers, parks, and local transit areas. But the grainy, low-quality images of the early 1990s made identifying a suspect nearly impossible. They did, however, begin to map the geography of the killings. A pattern emerged, rough perimeter-centered, around Mosman. This was his hunting ground. He knew its streets, its shortcuts, its blind spots. That knowledge made him even more dangerous. Then came the fourth murder. Same method, same profile. But this time, there was a slight mistake. A handbag, left behind, had traces of partial fingerprints. Not enough for a definitive match, but enough to give police hope. Forensic teams worked day and night, comparing prints against known offenders, but the results were inconclusive. Whoever this man was, he didn't have a criminal record, or, if he did, it had been carefully erased. The case was now officially a task force operation. Psychological profilers were brought in, and what they described sent a chill through the room. The killer was likely in his late 40s to early 60s, intelligent, educated, with a history of resentment toward maternal figures, possibly someone who had worked or volunteered with elderly women, a man with a need to control, to dominate, a man who, in his mind, was righting a lifelong wrong. He viewed these murders not as crimes, but as corrections. One profiler said, "He probably feels invisible, overlooked, but when he kills, he becomes someone feared, someone powerful." It was a theory that would prove disturbingly accurate in the months to come. Despite the growing profile, the killer remained a step ahead. He changed his timing, he changed his approach, but he never changed his victims. That fixation remained constant. Detectives were haunted by the idea that he was watching them, perhaps even blending in at the scenes, offering condolences, taking mental notes. The brazenness of his crimes suggested someone who not only believed he wouldn't be caught, but felt invincible. The city was now on high alert. Patrols increased. Community watch groups formed. Every man who fit the general description became a suspect. And yet, nothing. No arrests, no major leads. Just more fear, more questions, more bodies. It was clear now that the monster of Mosman, as some quietly began to call him, wasn't finished. He was just getting started. John Wayne Glover was two men living in the same skin. To those around him, he was a harmless, even likable presence, a reliable husband, a devoted stepfather, a polite neighbor who never raised his voice. But there was another side, one that only revealed itself behind closed doors or in the brief, horrifying moments of his attacks. The truth was, Glover wore his disguise so well that even those closest to him never suspected a thing. He had built his life around routine. He worked for a pie distribution company, delivering baked goods across Sydney. It gave him the perfect excuse to drive through quiet neighborhoods without raising suspicion. It also gave him time to watch, time to plan, time to find his next victim. When he wasn't working, he was volunteering at the Senior Citizen Society in Mosman, a seemingly altruistic role that brought him even closer to the type of women he secretly despised. To the elderly women who knew him, John Glover was gentle and respectful. He remembered birthdays. He helped with groceries. He listened to their stories. In truth, these acts weren't done out of kindness, they were reconnaissance. Each woman he helped was a potential target, each encounter a chance to rehearse the mask of empathy he wore so convincingly. It was all part of his performance, and it worked flawlessly. At home, his wife didn't suspect a thing. Glover kept his dark impulses well hidden, burying them beneath layers of mundane domestic life. He cooked dinner. He helped with chores. He joked with his stepdaughters. The compartmentalization of his life was surgical, one part family man, one part cold-blooded killer. He even managed to suppress his growing compulsions for months at a time, giving the illusion that the murders had stopped. But they hadn't. They were simply waiting, simmering just beneath the surface. When he felt the urge return, Glover became obsessive. He'd wander through shopping centers, watching older women walk alone. He studied their habits, their routines, their gait, how often they stopped to rest. He would often carry a small hammer in a shopping bag and a pair of stockings tucked into his pocket. The weapon was always close, always ready. Once he selected a target, he followed her at a distance, watching for the right moment to strike. That moment always came, and when it did, he was quick, efficient, brutal. The murders followed a disturbing ritual. First, the ambush, usually from behind, a sharp blow to the head, enough to stun or kill. Then, the strangulation, always with the victim's own pantyhose, tied in the signature double knot. And finally, the presentation. Glover would often place the body in a specific position, sometimes laying the purse beside it or adjusting the victim's clothing. These weren't just killings, they were statements, messages, a display of control. Psychologists would later point to Glover's childhood as a breeding ground for his hatred. He had grown up in England with a domineering mother and an unstable home life. He carried deep resentment toward women who reminded him of his mother, women who, in his view, had humiliated or rejected him. His victims were not random. They were surrogates for his unresolved rage. He wasn't killing strangers. He was killing symbols. What made Glover even more dangerous was his awareness. He knew how to appear normal, how to deflect suspicion. In fact, he often inserted himself into conversations about the murders, speculating with others about who the killer might be. Once, he allegedly attended a community meeting about the recent killings, sitting silently among grieving families and concerned residents. He may have even spoken to detectives investigating his own crimes. He was also deeply careful. After each murder, he would discard his clothes, wash thoroughly, and resume his regular routine as if nothing had happened. He avoided leaving forensic evidence. He kept no trophies. He was methodical in covering his tracks. But even the most calculated killers make mistakes, and Glover was no exception. He started to get sloppy. He began keeping a journal, cryptic and poetic, but unmistakably tied to the murders. Inside, he wrote about death, about power, and about old women. There were also list details about his victims, notes on potential targets. While he may have believed these writings were clever or obscure, they would eventually become key evidence in confirming his identity. One particularly disturbing entry simply read, "No more grannies." It was as if Glover saw himself on a mission, a twisted crusade he couldn't stop even if he wanted to. His compulsion had grown stronger than his disguise. The killer was starting to bleed into the man, and the mask was beginning to crack. Despite his increasing boldness, the people around him remained unaware. He was still the smiling man at the grocery store, the friendly volunteer, the husband who brought home dinner. He was still invisible, still trusted, still safe. But for how much longer? The duality of John Wayne Glover, the caring stepfather, and the sadistic predator would eventually collapse under the weight of his own ego. And when it did, the monster would be exposed for what he truly was, a man who had fooled everyone, until he didn't. By late 1990, fear had taken hold of Mosman, like a cold, choking fog. The once peaceful suburb was now stained with suspicion and dread. Parks sat empty. The sound of footsteps behind you, once meaningless now, quickened the pulse of every elderly woman who dared to walk alone. It was no longer safe to leave the house in daylight, much less in the evening. The monster of Mosman, as he was now whispered about in private circles, had turned the North Shore into a hunting ground. The murders weren't just frequent, they were fearless. The killer wasn't lurking in shadows. He was striking in broad daylight, often in public places. One victim was attacked just outside her own home. Another, near a shopping center, where dozens of people passed through every hour. And each time, the method was the same. Blunt force trauma to the head, followed by strangulation with the victim's own stockings, the signature double knot, a chilling, deliberate pattern. People started to question how this could be happening. Someone could kill with such brazenness and still vanish without a trace. The police, now fully aware that they were dealing with a serial killer, ramped up efforts. Task forces were assigned. Detectives worked around the clock. Elderly women were urged not to walk alone. Community meetings were held. But still, the killer kept moving, always one step ahead, always unseen. The press were relentless. Headlines screamed "Granny Killer Strikes Again" and "Serial Killer on the Loose in Sydney's North." The city, for all its sprawling beaches and sparkling harbors, had become the backdrop for a horror story unfolding in real time. The public wanted justice. The police needed a break. But the killer offered neither. Behind the scenes, detectives were piecing together what little evidence they had. There were no eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, no murder weapon recovered. What they had were patterns, geographic clusters, behavioral consistencies, and a psychological profile beginning to form. The killer, they believed, was local someone who knew the area intimately. Someone comfortable enough to strike during the day and disappear before anyone could respond. But, most disturbingly, someone who may have been hiding in plain sight. They began interviewing known offenders in the area, cross-referencing names, checking alibis. But the process was slow, and the pressure was mounting. Every day that passed, without an arrest, was another day the killer could strike again. And he would. What no one knew then was that the killer had been among them the entire time. John Wayne Glover's, smiling, helpful, almost invisible, had not only attended public events following the murders, but he had also visited hospitals and retirement homes where some of his future victims lived. He wasn't hiding from the fear. He was walking through it, breathing it in, feeding off of it. There were rumors, small ones, barely taken seriously, that someone had seen a man lingering near the site of a recent murder. Someone quiet, older, maybe in his 50s, but the details were vague, and the public image of a serial killer didn't match John Glover's appearance. He was clean, polite, average, not the sort of man you'd fear in a crowd. And that was his greatest weapon, his invisibility. The fear spread faster than facts. Shops saw fewer elderly customers. Neighbors began watching each other with suspicion. Some moved out of the area entirely. There was a quiet panic growing, the kind that doesn't scream but simmers. It was a communal paranoia, thick and suffocating. And in the middle of it all, the killer kept walking the same streets, unseen. But like all monsters who grow too confident, Glover made a mistake. It was late one afternoon when he attacked an elderly woman near her apartment complex. But this time, she didn't die. She fought back. She screamed, and someone heard. Glover fled the scene, disappearing before anyone could get a good look at him. The woman, though injured, survived, and her account was clear. A mid-man, average height, carrying a shopping bag. Not a thug, not a shadowy figure, just normal. The description narrowed the field, but it was still vague, yet it was the first break in the case. Detectives now knew the killer wasn't a ghost. He could be hurt, he could be identified, and that realization gave them something they hadn't had before: hope. Around the same time, John Wayne Glover's behavior began to change. He became withdrawn, moody. His coworkers noticed he was drinking more heavily. His family sensed something was wrong, but no one knew just how far things had gone. Glover was unraveling. The pressure, the double life, the inability to kill without consequence, it was all catching up to him, and it wouldn't be long before the cracks in his facade began to show. But for a time, the terror continued. Police presence intensified. Undercover officers patrolled the streets. The community held its breath, and Glover, though shaken, continued to hunt. But the boldness was gone. The precision began to fade. The monster was slipping. Still, the question remained: who was he, and when would he strike again? They didn't know it yet, but the end of John Wayne Glover's spree was closer than anyone realized. Not because of brilliant police work or a sudden slip of evidence, but because the monster burdened by the weight of his secrets was about to implode. It all began to unravel on a warm November day in 1990. For over a year, John Wayne Glover had carried out his crimes with frightening precision. He had struck terror into an entire community and eluded capture at every turn, but the cracks were beginning to show. Inside, the mask he had so carefully worn was slipping, and the weight of his double life was crushing him. The monster of Mosman, the man who had once seemed so in control, was spiraling toward collapse. On November 20th, Glover attempted another attack. This time, his target was 82-year-old Daisy Roberts. He had followed her from the shops near Military Road, watching her struggle with her shopping bags as she approached her apartment building. As she opened her door, he rushed her, just as he had so many times before. But something went wrong. She fought back. She screamed. A neighbor opened their door, just in time to catch a glimpse of the fleeing attacker. Glover had lost his nerve. For the first time, he didn't finish the job. That failed attack shook him. He wasn't the ghost he thought he was. People were seeing him now. The walls were closing in. And so, in an act that surprised even seasoned detectives, Glover made a decision that revealed the depths of his unraveling. Just days later, he checked into a small hotel room in North Sydney, alone, quiet, and carrying with him the one thing he could never completely silence: his guilt. Inside that room, Glover attempted to end his life. He wrote a note, trembling, cryptic, but unmistakably tied to the murders. Among the scrawled lines was one that would haunt detectives for years: "No more grannies." It was a confession and a cry for help. But fate, or perhaps karma, intervened. Glover survived. When emergency services found him, he was unconscious, but alive. At first, the note was taken as a sign of depression, possibly linked to alcohol or personal issues. But one detective, assigned to the growing serial murder task force, saw something more. The note's tone, the language, the peculiar reference. Two elderly women, it aligned with everything they had been seeing. Something didn't sit right. And so, they started to dig. The investigation into Glover's life began quietly. At first glance, he seemed ordinary, almost boring. But as detectives spoke with his co-workers, his wife, and those at the Senior Citizen Society where he volunteered, strange inconsistencies emerged. He had been absent on days the murders occurred. He had changed his delivery routes without explanation. And then there was his criminal record, a string of petty offenses in his youth back in England, including assault charges, all of which had flown under the radar until now. Police obtained a warrant and searched his home. That's when everything began to fall apart. In his garage, tucked away in a small cabinet, they found a hammer, the kind that matched the blunt force injuries suffered by several of the victims. There was also a journal, bizarre and poetic, filled with disturbing entries about older women, power, and death. One page was covered in scribbled names, first names only, but the police recognized some of them. There were names of victims. Most chilling of all, tucked between the pages of the notebook, were handwritten timelines, lists of locations and times, almost like stalking schedules. He had been keeping notes on his movements, tracking his thoughts. It wasn't just planning, it was ritual. When Glover was finally well enough to be interviewed, the police confronted him with what they had found. At first, he denied everything. He was calm, flat, almost robotic. But after hours of pressure, something shifted. Maybe it was the fatigue. Maybe it was the weight of the secret finally pressing too hard on his chest. Whatever it was, John Wayne. Glover began to talk. What followed was a confession unlike anything the detectives had ever heard. Glover admitted to the murders of 6 elderly women. He described each attack in chilling detail: the planning, the stalking, the moment of violence, and the strange calm that followed. He didn't cry. He didn't show remorse. At one point, when asked why he did it, he responded coldly, "Because I could." He spoke about his hatred for older women, particularly those who reminded him of his mother. He blamed them for his failures, his anger, his emptiness. Killing them, he said, gave him a sense of control. It made him feel powerful. He told police he never expected to be caught. And for a time, he genuinely believed he wouldn't be. He was invisible, he said. He was careful. But he admitted that with each murder, it became harder to stop. He had thought about quitting after the second, then the third, but the urges always came back. Detectives were stunned by the honesty of his confession. It was as if Glover had been waiting to tell someone, anyone. The pressure of the dual life had finally broken him. He was done hiding. News of his arrest sent shockwaves across Sydney. The man responsible for the terrifying killing spree wasn't a monster in the shadows. He was a neighbor, a volunteer, a family man. The city struggled to comprehend the duality, the mask he wore so convincingly. For the families of the victims, there was relief, but also a hollow ache. Nothing could undo what he had done. No confession could bring back their mothers, their grandmothers, their friends. But at least now, the killing had stopped. The monster of Mosman had been unmasked, and beneath it was not a beast, just a man who had fooled them all. When John Wayne Glover stood in court, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and slacks, it was hard for many to reconcile the image before them with the horrors they had come to know. He didn't look like a predator. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone's father, someone's neighbor. But the courtroom knew better. Behind the calm expression and measured voice stood a man who had mercilessly taken the lives of 6 elderly women and likely would have continued had he not been stopped. The trial began in 1991 and was one of the most chilling in Australian history. The courtroom was packed: journalists, victims' families, curious members of the public. They all came to see the man who had terrorized the city with such cold precision. Glover's demeanor was eerily composed throughout the proceedings. He showed no remorse, no emotion. Only occasionally would his eyes flicker with some internal thought, as though he were mentally reviewing the acts he had so carefully committed. Prosecutors presented the timeline of his crimes in harrowing detail. The weapon, the notes, the confession, it was all laid bare. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was Glover's own words during the recorded interviews that disturbed the public most. He didn't stumble or falter when discussing the killings. He described the attacks with an eerie calm, explaining the method, the moments of silence that followed, and the sense of relief he felt afterward, as if each murder gave him a brief respite from the storm raging inside his mind. He claimed he never meant for it to begin that way, that the first time was a moment of rage, but what started as a single act quickly became a pattern, an addiction, something he needed. He admitted to targeting women who reminded him of his mother, demanding, unloving. They nagged, they judged, he said, as though that were reason enough for execution. The court heard from psychologists and forensic psychiatrists, all of whom had examined Glover after his arrest. They testified that he suffered from a personality disorder, likely rooted in childhood trauma and unresolved anger. He harbored a pathological hatred of elderly women, especially those who displayed any form of independence or assertiveness. But while his mental health was unstable, experts agreed that he understood right from wrong. He could control his actions. He chose not to. Glover's defense didn't attempt to deny his actions. They argued for diminished responsibility due to his mental condition, but the court was unconvinced. This wasn't the work of someone confused or unaware. This was cold, calculated murder. Each crime bore the mark of planning, control, a deliberate signature. On November 28, 1991, John Wayne Glover was found guilty of 6 counts of murder. The judge did not mince words during sentencing. He called Glover's crimes heinous and his lack of remorse deeply disturbing. He sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a rare sentence in Australia at the time, and one that underscored just how monstrous his actions had been. There was no applause, no celebration, just a collective sigh of relief. The nightmare was over. But for the families of the victims, closure was complicated. Some described it as a hollow victory. Their loved ones were still gone. The fear they had lived with still lingered in their bones. One daughter of a victim said in an interview, "It doesn't bring my mom back, but at least I know he won't hurt anyone else." Glover was transferred to Lithgow Correctional Center, where he was held under strict conditions. Inmates referred to him simply as Granny Killer, a title that earned him neither respect nor sympathy. He rarely spoke to anyone and spent most of his time in solitary confinement. Over the years, his health declined. The once composed man began to deteriorate. There were reports of him pacing in his cell, talking to himself, mumbling incoherently. It was as if the horrors he had committed were finally catching up to him. Despite the passage of time, he never expressed genuine remorse. He never reached out to the families of his victims, never apologized. Instead, he seemed to vanish into himself, withdrawing more and more until there was barely anything left. In 2005, after nearly 15 years behind bars, John Wayne Glover took his own life. Inside his prison cell, he used the bedsheets to hang himself, leaving behind no note, no explanation, just silence. For some, his death brought finality. For others, it was too quick, too easy an end for a man who had caused so much pain. After his death, questions lingered. Could more have been done to stop him sooner? Were there victims who had never been identified? Was there something in his past that might explain the darkness he carried? Investigators reopened cold cases, re-examined old files, but no additional murders were ever definitively linked to him. Still, the possibility haunted detectives. Today, the story of John Wayne Glover remains one of Australia's most disturbing criminal cases. Not just for the brutality of the murders, but for the terrifying normalcy of the man who committed them. He wasn't a stranger lurking in alleyways. He wasn't a madman raving in the streets. He was a father, a husband, a volunteer, a man who smiled as he plotted, who laughed as he planned, who walked among his victims unnoticed. The monster of Mosman wasn't born in the shadows. He lived in the sunlight. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all.